Hello, and welcome back to the Speaking Lions. Today, I want to say something more about the existential problem of evil. I've done a whole video on this. That was the video, The Problem of Evil 4. So have a look at that for a more detailed explanation of what the existential problem of evil is. Here I'm just going to summarize it briefly and then summarize my objection to it briefly. Hopefully I'll be brief. I'll try my best. Doesn't come to me naturally, I'm afraid. And then I want to use it via consideration of an objection to my line of argument. I want to take that objection and use it as a segue into thoughts about a concept that I think is absolutely central to religious faith, and certainly Christian faith, which is a form of hope that I call radical hope. With apologies to Jonathan Lear for that term. And in the course of the exposition, I hope the title of the video, the meaning of the title, A Splash of Yellow, will become apparent to you. So first of all, what is the existential problem of evil? Well, as you know, the standard intellectual problem of evil is the problem of how do you reconcile the existence of a omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good creator of the world with the existence of horrendous evil in the world, and that is considered to be fundamentally a ratiocinative, cognitive, intellectual problem. Not the same problem, not to be confused, it is standardly insisted, with the problem of how do you cope with evil in your life? How do you keep faith in God, given evil in the world? How do we defeat evil in the world? How do we deal with its political ramifications? That latter problem, the religious problem or the existential problem or the personal problem or the political problem in some versions, that's a problem for pastors, therapists, counselors, friends, and so forth. But it's distinct from the problem that philosophers address, which is the strictly intellectual problem about the consistency or the probability of the consistency of a set of propositions, or the probability of one proposition given another set of propositions. Okay, now in recent times, philosophers have, analytic philosophers who normally concentrate on the intellectual problem of evil pretty much exclusively, have started to give more attention to the existential problem. Just to mention two of them, before I mention the two, I should first say that the approach of, not all of them, but of many of these philosophers, especially those with an English-speaking analytical background, is to approach the matter in a way which I can only describe as quantitative. And let me give two quick examples that I used in the original video, The Problem of Evil 4. First is that of Cameron Bertuzzi from his YouTube channel, well known for his YouTube channel Capturing Christianity. He points out, addressing the question, the question he addresses is, who can deal better with the existential problem of evil? Who can deal better with the problem of how to find meaning in life, to find the world a good, a worthwhile place, a place in which you can still find inspiration to live a meaningful human life? Who has the better resources to do that, despite all the evil in the world? Does the Christian have the better resources, or does the atheist? So addressing this question, Cameron Bertuzzi says that the theist is in the superior position because they can draw on much richer resources than the atheist. To quote Cameron, he speaks of the Christian has available to them the concept of, quote, a loving father at the foundation of all reality, and a confidence that, these words are crucial, quote, every case of suffering, every case indeed, serves some greater purpose, a greater good. Now, those words, the second set of words in particular, the second quotation, I think clearly indicate a quantitative bent of thinking. And this is even more apparent in the British-based philosopher Eugen Nagasawa, who has a whole book on the subject indeed. And he describes something he calls existential optimism in explicitly quantitative terms. The optimist, the existential optimist, sees more yellow in the world than he does grey, where the yellow is the positive things, the goods, and the grey is the negative things, the evils. And like Cameron Bertuzzi, he says the theist, compared to the atheist, has more resources, more yellow, to deal with evil in the world. In particular, the Christian has a belief in a life after death, which offers unlimited scope for addressing any deficit of yellow in the present life. So no matter how much the deficit of yellow relative to grey may be in the current dispensation, one can simply overwhelm it with an avalanche of yellow in the post-mortem existence. Okay, so to simplify somewhat, admittedly, but I think not unfairly, I think it's reasonable to say that they do have a quantitative, almost arithmetic. I mean, of course, they wouldn't claim, I would think that one can exactly measure these things, but one can have a rough measurement of them. And so I'm going to talk about their having a quantitative or arithmetic approach. But it's an approach I reject. I want to argue against that kind of existential arithmetic because I think it's profoundly untrue to the way in which human beings actually react to the world. And in fact, people's faith in the world, their ability to find meaning in it, or their ability, or if ability is the right word, perhaps I should say their vulnerability to hopelessness and despair and wretchedness is not a function of numbers. It's not a matter of arithmetic. And I give in the previous video, I give two quick examples. One of how just one bit of grey, okay, one terrible event, one appalling evil can completely rob a person of all their ability to love the world or to feel at home in it or to feel hope for the future and so on. So for that, I'm a case of a single bit of grey, a splash of grey, we might say. I offer a fictitious example, but still I think a realistic one, that of Ivan Karamazov in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. And I'm sure you're familiar with the example. Ivan tells the story of a young child tortured by her own parents. And this single case makes the world, and indeed makes the world, this single case makes the world unredeemable in Ivan's eyes. No amount or kinds of greater goods, no amount of yellow, okay, can set this to rights, can make up for it, can redeem the world. For him, God and all his works cannot make him, Ivan, willing to accept the world. Even if it convinces others, it does not convince him. Now, if you think this attitude is melodramatic, I would invite you simply to think of those who have lost a child. Now, not everyone who loses a child, I know not everyone who loses a child uh, or whose child suffers the most horrendous things. Not all of them lose their faith in life, their hope in life on that account. That's true, but you certainly can. And it's far from obvious that we're in a position to condemn such people as being. We might have all sorts of problems with their reaction or issues with it, but it's not obvious that their reaction is irrational. Or rather, perhaps truer to say, it's far from clear that the concepts of rationality and irrationality are adequate to deal with this kind of, with assessing that kind of reaction. And if you doubt that, just think of this hypothetical situation. A parent is offered a choice, and I'm sorry if the example seems somewhat tasteless. There may be some risk that it is, but I'm going to use it because I think it serves to make the point here, and I can't think of any other way of making the point so effectively at the moment. But if you imagine the example, imagine a hypothetical case of parents offered a choice between their child being tortured in the way that Ivan Karamazov imagines, but is then compensated with an eternity of bliss, and you ask them to choose between that and the child having a relatively pleasant, 70 years and 10, relatively normal human lifespan, at least as we now enjoy it in developed part of the world. I think the question answers itself. I think any parent is going to choose the latter of those two options. And I think that kind of imaginary case shows that there's something radically wrong with an arithmetical approach to this. The second example, of course, goes the other way. A case which we might call a splash of yellow. Okay, so this is what that title means. And this is the case where, in the midst of the most horrendous darkness in the world, a single act, a single light in the darkness actually illuminates the entire darkness. A single spot of yellow overwhelms all the grey. And it's a real life example from Ruth Kluger, a Holocaust survivor, and the account that she gives in her book, Still Alive, A Holocaust Girlhood Remembered. And I'll quote from it. I hope this is not going to make everything all too long, but anyway. I think you need to hear it again. We need to hear it again. So she writes, I need to explain the background to it first. When she was transported by train to Auschwitz, as you know, when the prisoners arrived in Auschwitz, they were subject to the selections where the camp capos would decide who perhaps was fit enough or had a skill which made them in some way useful to the effective running of the machinery of death. So they would be kept alive for a little while. All the others, which certainly included young children, would typically go straight to the gas chambers. In this instance, what happened to Ruth, and she was only 6, 7, 8 years old, something like that, I forget exactly. Present next to her when she reached the top of the queue for the selections was a teenage girl, maybe 15, 16, 17, something like that, I'm not sure how old, who proceeded to argue with the capo and somehow or other convinced them that they should spare the child, at least for the time being. And she did so at huge risk to herself. And one imagines that, in fact, though Kluger doesn't say this. One imagines that effectively this girl either did or was prepared to substitute herself for Ruth. And so Ruth survived. She doesn't say, as I recall, what happened to the other girl. Quite possibly she effectively did give her life to save Ruth. But whether or not that happened, she certainly took serious risk of it. And what Ruth says is, in describing this act, many decades later in her life, she writes the following words. It was an act of the kind that is always unique, no matter how often it occurs. That's, by the way, I can't help digressing, can I? Can't help myself. That's an interesting thought. An act which is unique, though it's been repeated many times. It was an act of the kind that is always unique, no matter how often it occurs. An incomprehensible act of grace, or put more modestly, a good deed. Yet the first term, an act of grace, is perhaps closer to the truth, although the agent was human and the term is religious. For it came out of the blue sky and was as undeserved as if its originator had been up in the clouds. I was saved by a young woman who was in as helpless a situation as the rest of us, and who nonetheless wanted nothing other than to help me. The more I think about the following scene, the more astonished I am about its essence, about someone making a free decision to save another person in a place which prompted the instinct of self-preservation to the point of crime and beyond. It was both unrivaled and exemplary. Neither psychology nor biology explains it. The good is incomparable and inexplicable as well, because it doesn't have a proper cause outside itself, and because it doesn't reach for anything beyond itself. I wonder if that has something to do with the notion of uniqueness. Anyway, a little bit more. If a prisoner passed on the beatings he received to those even more helpless than he was merely reacting as psychology and biology would expect him to. But if he did the reverse? And so one might argue that in the perverse environment of Auschwitz, absolute goodness was a possibility, like a leap of faith beyond the humdrum chain of cause and effect. I don't know how often it was consummated. Surely not often. Surely not only in my case, but it existed. I am a witness. Notice that she says specifically that this, although this has certainly happened in her own case, that she witnessed it, that it surely did happen on other, she wasn't the only case. She nevertheless says explicitly, I don't know how often it was consummated, surely not often. In other words, she's frankly recognizing the fact that it's going to be a rare thing, as surely indeed it is. Well, it seems to me that her approach here is most definitely not something that can be readily, to fit this into the suitcase, you're going to have to cut a lot off into the quantitative suitcase. What Ruth was witness to that day, I think, likely had no effect at all on her empirical expectations of the likelihood of her surviving, or on any empirical expectations about how the war or the world as a whole would go, whether that would go more or less agreeably. She was no Pollyanna, okay? The effect that it did have on her lies less in what she explicitly says, that I've just quoted, than in its tone and its spirit. It is not mere optimism. Indeed, it's not clear it's optimism at all. thinking of optimism at least as empirical expectations about things turning out well or going well. And it is indeed compatible with a severe pessimism, although it's not compatible with bitterness or misanthropy or despair, but it is compatible with pessimism. And it's more too, much more, than mere animal relief at surviving. It is more like a gratitude, not just to the young woman for her act, but for the world that could contain such, quote, incomparable and inexplicable goodness. Sometimes, even in the midst of an ocean of grey and black, one splash of yellow is enough to restore a sense of the world as something good, as something beautiful, of life as something worth living, as something to be grateful for. To reiterate the main point, the matter is not settled by arithmetic. It's not settled by counting up the amounts of grey and yellow. There is nothing especially privileged about that quantitative perspective. If anything, it is an attempt to evade the issue, to camouflage the real existential response which each of us has under a spurious cloak of impersonality and objectivity. All that maths can be upset by a single case. And in other videos I've reiterated this point by arguing that the quantitative conception, that what I've said here is supported by, and the quantitative conception falsified by, for example, by Christianity itself. By, for example, what St. Paul says about love, that love does not keep a record of wrongs, nor does it keep a record of rights. Okay. And by the doctrine of the atonement, in which the whole world is redeemed in a single action. The submission to the crucifixion. Okay. I want now to turn to that finishes the summary of existential problem of evil and of the quantitative approach and my central criticism of it. I want now to come to what's original, what's new, which is I want to discuss, which is this. I mean, the idea is not original. The idea I'm going to discuss is not original to me, but what's new by me, my new remarks by me to the notion of radical hope. And I first started thinking about this again recently, when thinking about the existential problem, I became worried about an objection. The objection goes something like this. Okay, let's grant that I'm sort of basically right, that there's something radically wrong with the quantitative approach. You don't need any kind of arithmetic preponderance of good over evil in order to love the world, let's say. But what you do need, it might be argued, what you do need for a sense of the world as basically good is a belief that one day, or in the end, the good will triumph over the evil. The good will win out. Now, this thought has kind of niggled away at me at the back of my mind for a long time, and I resisted it for a long time. But now I'm inclined to think that something must be conceded to it. One doesn't want to, push the anti-quantitative point, or to push it, or the anti-quantitative argument, so far that it becomes inhumane. And one thinks here of the Socratic ideal of that goodness is its own reward, as vice is its own punishment. Can be profound and inspiring, but it's also at some risk of being somewhat chilling and cold. So I needed to think again about it. So let's come back again to my claim that Ruth's experience did not affect her empirical expectations, short or long term, about how the world or any part of the world would actually go on, about how her life would go on. But I do want to stress there my use of the word expectations. What it gave her was not a belief that the world would go this way rather than that way. It was not a prediction or forecast about the future. What she was given, rather, was something we might express with the word hope. And I'm inclined to say not just a hope, not some particular or specific hope in some specific thing, but rather something more like hope with a capital H, hope per se. Or what Jonathan Lear, in his fine book with this title, calls radical hope. I should add, by the way, that what I'm going to go on to say, you shouldn't attribute it to Lear. Sometime since I've read his book, it was 3 years ago, and I may have what I say here may depart from what he says in various ways, but it's certainly a book which stimulated my thinking about this matter. Well, in colloquial English, the word hope can certainly mean a prediction or expectation based on at least some evidence that raises its likelihood, its probability. It's usually it's the term which we use when that belief is held in the face of a substantial lot of evidence that things are pretty grim. We talk about hope when we're in dark circumstances. One thinks of Britain or France in 1940, where there seemed little prospect that the Nazi evil would ever be defeated. There wasn't a complete absence of evidence. There were grounds of an empirical sort for hope. For example, enticing the United States into the war, the strategy which eventually succeeded. But this is a hope that already, while based to some extent on evidence, nevertheless outstrips or goes beyond the evidence. It's not a mere function of evidence. Now, the hope of which I speak in speaking of radical hope is the limiting case of this. The word case, I'm not happy with the word case because it itself is misleading in various ways. Because we're talking about the world and life and history as a totality, not any specific instance inside it. But anyway, I'll continue to use the word. The hope of which I speak is the limiting case of this, the case where there is not only zero evidence, to support one's hope, but where the whole idea of evidence is beside the point, is out of place. That is why I call it hope per se, hope with a capital H, radical hope. Radical hope is not a prediction or an expectation. Let me give the example of Thomas More. More was executed as a traitor for refusing to recognise Henry VIII as the supreme head of the English Church. More did not go meekly to the gallows, He fought this for quite a long time with all the legal and political expedients available to him, not the least of which was his own canniness in their exploitation. Always remaining within the divine moral law in doing this. But nevertheless, eventually, all of these expedients was exhausted. He resigned himself to the fact that, and this qualification is crucial, he resigned himself to the fact that as far as any power of this world is concerned, let alone merely his own, he would never see his wife and family again. And yet, he was also sustained by the hope that he would see them again, though the world gave no support to this hope. Quite the opposite. All the evidence told the other way. This was more than ordinary hope. It was more than hope against hope. It was a baseless or radical hope. Now, it's obviously controversial as a matter of history for me to say that More thought he had no evidence for his hope. I do not know if he would have said he had no evidence, that it was baseless. Quite possibly, maybe even probably he would have. I mean, most people do. But I'm going to stick my neck out here and say that I'm going to treat this as irrelevant psychology. I do not believe that his hope, it's more of a rationalization than the real basis for his hope. I do not believe his hope really did arise from any evidence that he might cite. It arose partly from the beauty and meaning of his wife and family and of Christian marriage, from that of personal integrity compared to all the sordid transactions of expediency and realpolitik. And in his case also, no doubt crucially, the inspiration of Christ, the Bible, and Christian history. But I believe that what is salient in all that is its moral and spiritual inspiration, not evidence that supports historical forecast. I mean, obviously, much more needs to be said about this than I can say here. I'm sticking my neck out, as I say. But I want to get the idea out there, so at least it can be discussed. This is what I say gives it the character, it's this evidential baselessness that gives this the character of radical hope, the same sort of hope that Ruth Kluger had. He hopes for a union with his family because the things I have spoken of are true, the things I just listed. These things are true, beautiful, and righteous. But hang on, it might be said. We rely on hope, don't we? We act on it. And was that not true also for More? Did he not act on his hope? And does that not require evidence? Well, yes, we do rely on our hope. But it's not. But here, in the case of radical hope, that is not like relying on our armed forces or on our physical strength or on our wits or anything like that. It is less a matter of an empirical estimate of what resources are necessary to achieve a goal, but more a matter of inspiration, of faith that the cause is righteous and worth fighting for, not because the chances of winning are any good or reasonable, but simply because the cause is righteous. But more than that, this is not really about, this reliance is less about, it's not that we rely on this radical hope for what we do, for what particular acts we perform. That is a matter of worldly judgment largely, except when a moral line cannot be crossed. But nevertheless, for most acts, it's not so much which act we perform, that's a worldly decision, but rather a matter of how we carry out the act, the spirit in which we act. We have faith in things unseen, quote unquote, in the sense that we are faithful. Do not give way to despair. Do not give way to hopelessness. That we stay the course. More said, remarkably, shortly before his execution, or at least he's credited with saying this, that a man may lose his head and yet suffer no harm. Now, this is a very Socratic kind of statement, like Socrates saying that a good man cannot be harmed. And again, it may seem overly pious. I think it depends upon who says it and in what circumstances. Can't just consider it as an abstract, contextless proposition. But anyway, in saying that, I think whatever issues there are about it, More at least gave expression to a notion of radical hope. No matter how the world goes on, he's saying, even to the point of losing one's head, and yet one has not even suffered harm. Well, you might say that's over the top, but let's say a man may lose his head, and yet the world is still a beautiful place for which we can be grateful and which we can love. Radical hope is independent of the will, it is independent of effort. It comes as a gift, as a grace, as it did to Ruth Kluger. And in a sense, radical hope certainly is consistent with and perhaps even encourages or embraces notions like fatalism, or in a more theological vein, Calvinism. Now, I'm still insufficiently literate in theology to say very much here without making more of a goose of myself. But Calvinism is obviously a hotly contested idea. But whatever its issues, one can say this, that one potentially attractive feature of Calvinism is its sense that everything is in the hands of God and that we put our trust and our faith in the hands of God. That seems to me to be a way of lifting our hopes out of the daily commerce of the world. We don't try to discern, okay? We don't read the tea leaves of the nightly news, okay, to find our source of faith and hope, to find our source of the love of the world. Anyway. Okay, to return to the main line of thought here, does radical hope nevertheless make one irrational? Is it irrational to have hope? Isn't it irrational to have hope without evidence? Well, no, okay, because it is hope and not a prediction. Predictions require evidence, certainly, but not hope, at least not radical hope. The whole point is that it is not based on evidence. Okay, but if it is not based on evidence, then is it or should it be? Evidence is something that you get from within the world, okay? As I say, you read the tea leaves of events in history, okay? The goings on in the world. In time. And you try and extrapolate tendencies of patterns observable in the past and today into the future to make your predictions. But if radical hope is not based on evidence, okay, if it does not, as it were, base itself in the events of the world, then maybe the hope isn't about events in the timeline of the world at all. Okay, it's not about the future in the ordinary sense, in the sense in which I can say, there'll be a war next year, there'll be a grand final in the footy at the end of the year, that a certain party will win the next election, and so forth and so on. Okay, well, this is a profound question. a very profound question, a question, I guess, in Christian terms about eschatology. And I don't know the answer to it. I don't have a decided or fixed answer to this. So I'm going to finish this video with what I frankly admit to be a set of what I call dishevelled thoughts. So I'm just going to throw these thoughts out there and we can see where they take us. Okay, here are the dishevelled thoughts. I'll try and get through them quickly. So I've probably been going on for much too long. Okay, what is this hope a hope for? Is it for a hope for an event inside the timeline of the world? Okay, something that might be dated, something that happened on, the 19th of February 2074 or something. That's what I mean by an event inside the timeline of history. Could it be the gradual accumulation of worldly events? Okay, through the machinations and crafts of human effort, politics, and so forth. One thinks here of talk about the right side of history and the notion of progress. Things getting better over time. John Lennon's hope of a world without war and so forth. But these notions suggest evidence, and that's not radical hope, as I say. So as an account of radical hope, I rule it out. I don't by this wish to imply any kind of political quietism. Politics is important, but to place this kind of hope, I'm simply saying it's not the same thing as radical hope. Okay, next dishevelled thought. That first thought was a bit more definitive, but the rest will be more dishevelled. Is this hope a hope for an eruption into history, into the timeline in the world from something outside it? And yet still itself an event in history, an event in the timeline of the world. I simply leave that open as a question. Or is it something that is wholly outside the world considered as the historic timeline? This thought, that it's something wholly outside the world, might bring with it the thought that this is not to be thought of so much as something in the future, in the timeline of the world, but there's something already here, already accomplished. That one can live in the eternal now through how one lives. Be like the lilies of the field and so on. The eternal. That the reconciliation of God and man was accomplished through the crucifixion and resurrection. And this goes with the anti-arithmetic thought, the thought that sometimes a splash of yellow gives you a gestalt on the whole world, such that that yellow illuminates all the grey. It's a matter of it's a matter of a certain kind. To live in the eternal is to be in the eternal is to live in a way that gives a certain kind of perspective onto the world that is a perspective sub specie aeternitatis, from some point outside it. In that sense, it comes to you from outside the world. Is this just returning me to where I started? To my original rejection of any idea of an eventual triumph of goodness? Am I just back with that? Am I just back with Socrates and the idea that goodness is its own reward and so on? I don't know. I'm not sure that it is just the same thing. Next dishevelled thought. There is a connection here to the notion of prophecy. Now, prophecy looks like, and is popularly often considered to be, not just popularly, but also among scholars, as a form of forecast or prediction, or at least as including that as an essential part of it. I suspect that prophecy is not a reading of the worldly tea leaves. I mean, you do see people, looking at the nightly news to try and discern patterns that will lead them, together with biblical texts, to reach predictions about eschatological predictions and so forth. I don't think that prophecy is revelation. If it's revelation, it's something that comes from outside the world. We should not be looking, to try and read the events of the world. Over and over and again, the people of God were surprised and astonished about the turn of events, not least in the incarnation, the crucifixion and the resurrection. The kind of Messiah who came was not the one would most naturally understand from the prophecies that were made. Prophecies for political liberation were ones that could be possible, for which it was relevant to cite evidence or the lack of evidence. It's not clear that evidence has the same bearing on something like the incarnation of the Son of God. So I think that prophecy is less a matter of discerning patterns in events to prophesy the future or anything like that. And reading prophecy is not like that. It's got something more to do with radical hope. So finally, as my last dishevelled thought, I will simply finish on these words for further contemplation. These three abide: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love.